So I'm going to give you some thoughts about how climate change is affecting the invasive species issues today. This is similar to some remarks I made at the Invasive Species In-Service that some of you may have heard before then. So most of this material comes out of the Climate report. And as mentioned before, I owe a lot of the material that's in this slideshow to Holly Menninger, who was the coordinator of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute here at Cornell. She's moved on to other employment, working with citizen science. So with the greenhouse gases are rising in our atmosphere. There are a number of them. Carbon dioxide gets talked about the most, but there's also methane and nitrous oxide. And this first graph shows basically the last couple thousand years, and you can see that while there's tiny fluctuations in the atmosphere, it's thought that all these gases have been fairly stable until just the last century, basically. And they are all rising at a very high rate to values that they haven't been at in hundreds of thousands, if not some millions of years. And they're taking the temperature of the globe up with them. Greenhouse gases are an essential part of our atmosphere. Without them, it would be winter all the time. Without some degree of warming from these kinds of gases in our atmosphere, life as we know it wouldn't be possible. But this is taking us into a whole new trajectory and temperatures that the world hasn't seen for millions of years. So we already have evidence that the climate is changing. This is just a couple of climate zone maps used by gardeners. And you can compare 1990 with a similar map drawn up in 2006. And you can see each one of the colored zones reflects minimum temperatures, so for hardiness. And you can see that every one of these colored zones is migrating in a northward fashion over this 20-year period here. And associated with that, we have phenology changing in both native and invasive species. We see it in a large number of studies working with flowering times, a lot of phenology data, but we also see it in animal distributions, plants and species changing their ranges, as well as their phenological timing. So here's an old data set. It's got over here on the left of the screen is sort of a cartoon showing the state of New York potentially arriving down in Georgia by the end of the century if we have continue our current level of emissions of greenhouse gases. And this is, again, somewhat of a cartoon. It's a caricature only because it's, they picked out one aspect of climate, the temperature, and they're showing New York moving down. Of course, New York will never have a climate exactly like Georgia. It may be as hot in its average temperatures, but the day lengths won't be changing. Many aspects of humidity, storm tracks, the kinds of patterns of precipitation. So we're not trying to say that everything will be like Georgia, but temperatures could get that high, that radical of a change this century. So when we think about ecosystems under these kinds of huge changes, we expect large changes in the distribution. Plants are generally distributed on the landscape largely in response to climatic patterns. And with slow changes in climate, such as the world has seen in the past, these ranges of plants stays in the expectation is that they're in pretty good match with the current climates in the areas they are. But that won't be true this century. We will find that the sort of effective climate envelopes where species like maple, dominant tree species of our forests currently enjoy, will have moved north of us. And so if you look way over on the right hand, at the very top is sort of the current distribution. There's a lot of dark green in Maine and in the Adirondacks for spruce fir forests, very extensive oak maple forests, and little bits of some other things. But by the end, as you go down to the bottom, which is a high emissions end of the century map, you see that most of the oak maple has been replaced by, the maple beech birch has been replaced by oak hickory, and the spruce fir has disappeared completely. This won't happen overnight. Those district trees live longer than 1 century, so what we'll really have are changing recruitment patterns of new seedlings, dispersal of new species into the area, and in many cases stands which still are alive but under a great deal of stress and vulnerable to various kinds of invasions. So under this scenario, we're going to be asking ourselves, how do we maintain healthy ecosystems in the face of these changes, and what role will invasive species play? If we talk about these kinds of massive, huge changes in the distribution of dominant trees and shrubs, plants, animals, how does that open up the landscape to be more vulnerable to species invasions? And so this is just sort of emphasizing that we can make lists of species that will be decreasing in their abundance, and there's a smaller list of species that can be identified that have some presence already in the area but will greatly expand their presence. And invasive species could be an important part of that gaining suitable habitat list. So here's a list of just what we expect in terms of total changes in climate in New York over this coming century. And temperatures are likely to rise between 4 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That low end is probably associated with us changing our energy use patterns, and the high end is looking more and more likely in terms of the energy use trajectories we're currently on. This is going to lead to longer growing seasons, more incidents of heat stress, increased summer water requirements. And so there may be more periods of drought stress in the summer, not so much because we're expecting huge droughts with this, but because the water demand, the requirement in these longer, hotter summers will increase, and water and rainfall may not keep up with that. We expect large reductions in snow cover, lake surface freezing. This will affect pest overwintering and nutrient retention. We actually expect small increases in total annual precipitation in this area. That's most likely to come in the winter or early spring. There's not a lot of confidence in those precipitation predictions. We probably, if you put it all together, would expect that we'll still have a very wet winter and spring season. Lake levels could be higher at their highest point than in the past. But midsummer low flows are likely to be reduced further than they are today. So there'll be perhaps a greater range of lake levels and flow levels in rivers and streams throughout the whole season. And then, again, summer rainfall patterns are not likely to meet the increased plant water requirements in these longer, hotter summers. A lot more of our rainfall is going to come in heavy rainfall events instead of being distributed as much in a number of small episodes. And that'll involve increased stormwater runoff. Some sites with poor drainage may experience more flooding. Floodplains certainly have been much more active and probably will continue in that way. And stream and river ecology will be impacted by these more variable flow rates. And there are huge impacts if you're near the coast as sea level continues to rise, but I'm not going to try to touch on those much today. So for ecosystems, the strategies for natural ecosystems is to try to maintain healthy ecosystems. And one of the reasons is to minimize other stressors. These include eutrophication, pollution, acid rain, but very especially in this context, invasive species themselves. And then You'll hear a lot of talk about things like manage primarily for important ecosystem services and biodiversity rather than attempting to maintain the exact mix of species present today. So that's something I'll come back to a few times in this talk because I think it's an important concept for those of you that are working with invasive species. It isn't a valid goal to try to think that the species list of any particular park or area at the end of this century will be or should be the same as it is today, unless we radically stop climate change in its tracks in a way that we certainly don't have the momentum for that yet. On the other hand, that means that a lot of species will be moving into our area from the south that currently didn't have distributions this far north, but they will be extended. I'll be arguing repeatedly that those kinds of species and range expansions should not necessarily be considered invasive species. That is, in part, the geoflora of the continent responding to this new and dramatic change in the climatic distribution. On the other hand, there will be species among those that we very much do want to fight against and stop. So you'll be on the front lines of making those decisions. Facilitate natural adaptation by minimizing habitat fragmentation, protecting riparian zones and other corridors for dispersal and migration. So in the context of ecosystems and keeping the background ecosystem healthy, one of the things we're very worried about is not having enough in the way of dispersal corridors. I know that in the invasive species communities, you're often concerned about dispersal corridors in a negative sense of highways and areas of traffic movement, whatever they may be, boats, airplanes that are bringing in unwanted dispersal. In the context of climate change, we need large and intact tracts of contiguous communities so that natural dispersal of the bulk native flora can occur in response to the climate shifts. And then we need institutionalized monitoring and coordination. These are things that you see in all the reports, and we do need them very much. And of course, it's very hard to get funding for those kinds of things in the current climate. But okay, that seems like it went the wrong direction. Okay, so getting to the heart of the invasive species part of the talk. How will climate change affect invasive species? Sorry, I hope that you can still hear me. We've got some building construction going on next door. I didn't expect that this morning. What role will invasive species play in changing ecosystems? What are the consequences of climate change on invasive species management? So all three of those first items could be considered vulnerabilities, ways in which climate change will exacerbate invasive species problems. And then under adaptive strategies, we want to know how do we adjust our management practices to moderate harm. So just running through some of these vulnerabilities in a little more detail. We've already talked here, we've got those same maps showing how as the respective climate zones are shifting northward, the vegetation would be expected to follow them. That would be the best result. The more negative result is that we don't get that natural response of the native vegetation, and we get a lot of invasives moving in to fill the void. We are seeing range expansions of pests that are present further south, like kudzu. This is a picture of an infestation in Albany. So certainly I'm not suggesting that those kinds of plants should be taken off of the hit list. It's all the more reason to be vigilant. Some invasive pests like the hemlock woolly adelgid, climate change is perhaps a part of the story, that it's not being limited in its expansion as much as we had hoped. And there will be many species that are currently kept out by the cold winter temperatures that will more easily be able to get established. An interesting feature of a lot of several studies now comparing native and non-native species has to do with phenological flexibility. So the non-natives, and especially the aggressive invasive non-natives, tend to show more phenological plasticity as the climate changes. So in areas where they have long-term records, they're finding, so for instance in Thoreau's woods here, they're finding that many of the invasive species that are displacing natives in these areas are characterized by larger responses to the changing climate. So they are blooming earlier, so are the natives, but the non-natives have made a larger response to the same amount of climate shift. And there's another report that just came out in Nature this month talking about many understory species tend to extend the season after leaf fall for as much as a month longer than the native understory species do. So natives are, the invasives seem to be naturally prone or have been selected to be very flexible and very responsive to subtle changes in climate. That may be one of the things that makes them so invasive. We also have altered pathways of dispersal, everything from the opening of the Northwest Passage to our increased use of air travel and air shipping to the large storms that can bring in propagules. And finally, the efficacy of some management tools themselves will be altered by climate change. So earlier and longer growing seasons will require more resources. It may just require more management events to achieve the same kind of control, whether it's mechanical or chemical. Biocontrols, as the climate changes, every organism has its own mechanism of tracking the climate, and there can be mismatches in the phenology. There also can be some pesticides, like glyphosate, have been shown to work less effectively under very high CO2. So that could be a gradual change through the century as well. And in any kind of a restoration project, again, one needs to look very strongly at future trajectories. So if you're trying to restore something, a picture of what it used to be is not necessarily the best thing that it should be planted. Natural shifts in vegetation should often be taken into account as restoration efforts are made. And so, again, this slide, I've already brought this up, but the northward native migrations and range shifts into our area is really one of the best case scenarios, as opposed to having unhealthy stands of trees and plants that are subject to insect attack, are subject to invasive species replacement. So effort really needs to be made on identifying which are the harmful species as opposed to just a species that isn't on an old species list for a given park or area. So we've sort of covered the vulnerabilities part of this, and I'm going to spend a few minutes looking at adaptive strategies. So some guiding principles for adaptation that are developed in the Climate report involve prioritization. I think these are things that are that you all work on a daily basis, but prioritization of habitats and invasive species with the limited resources, where should the lines be drawn? What can we expect of ecosystem resilience under multiple stressors? And again, I wanted to make that distinction between how you often may think as a community of avenues of rapid dispersal for some of these aggressive invasives, and what we're concerned with in terms of maintaining continuity of vegetation over large geographic tracts so that natural dispersal can occur. Adaptive capacity falls into some of those same concepts. Coordination, I think, is what your organization is all about, trying to coordinate resources, enlist citizenry at all scales. And data management and collection, you know, we really, given the massive changes that are happening, both in terms of the invasives and all of those problems, and now that's happening against a changing background of what's going to be happening in the native vegetation, it's going to require a lot of very accessible and centrally managed data to keep track of what, to allow the prioritization and other planning that needs to be done. And I do think that the PRISM system is, as I said earlier, you're going to be very much on the front lines of this. You'll be making some decisions. Increasingly, I think, you'll be running into plants that are new in your area that aren't necessarily imported from Europe or Asia, but are just migrating northward along new climatic gradients. And I think I've already touched on most of these things that I don't think I need to preach about these to this group. We definitely need some new risk assessment tools. We need new legislation such as aquatic invasive species transport laws. We need quite a few more real examples of theory and practice and demonstration projects, you know, to figure out what will work and what will continue to work under changing conditions. So, you know, the changing phenology, all of your management assessment procedures and protocols will need frequent recalibration. You know, anything that depends on catching plants at a particular stage of their phenology. You know, this year is a fairly extreme year, but the future is going to hold, you know, constant shifts and seems to be very erratic right now in those phenological relationships. And so finally, this is kind of my summary slide for climate change and invasive species. So what is really different? Native species lists are no longer static. I've tried to emphasize that because I think it's a very important concept. Invasive pressure is going to be greater than ever for a number of reasons, both because of the greater flux of propagules into the area and the fact that the milder climate is going to be a less intense screen against some of those. Control tactics will need frequent recalibration. And minimizing overall community transformation requires climate change mitigation. So, you know, in the climate change lingo, we talk about adaptation, which means climate change has happened, and, you know, what can we do to minimize the problems or take advantage of any opportunities that may have arisen. But mitigation is trying to stop climate change. And so, you know, trying to maintain communities that look somewhat like we're used to them really requires that we meet this challenge to a much greater extent than we have yet. And then what is the same? The innate resistance to invasive species requires diverse, healthy native communities. The early detective rapid response approach is more crucial than ever, and effective control requires coordinated networks. And I'd like to thank a lot of people who contributed to the ClimAid report, and I'd be happy to take questions or open the floor for discussion.